Hey, welcome back to Hush Warden Horrors. Tonight's story didn't come from a book or a forum or something buried in an old archive somewhere. It showed up in my inbox with no name attached to it, no return address, no explanation, just a file and a single line that said, "You've been watching this happen. You just don't see it yet." Now, I don't usually take anonymous submissions at face value, and most of what gets sent in is easy to dismiss once you look at it long enough. But this one stuck. Not because of what it claims outright, but because of how much of it lines up with things you've probably already noticed and tried not to think too hard about. Do I believe it? Maybe. I'm not saying I do, and I'm not saying I don't, but I will say this. It has a way of making the world outside feel a little more intentional than it should. And once that idea gets in, it doesn't leave easily. So listen to this the way it was sent, like a record of something someone wasn't supposed to understand, and decide for yourself whether it's just a story or an explanation hiding in plain sight. I first noticed something was wrong at a gas station off Route 9, the kind of place where the lights hum louder than the people, and the concrete always looks damp even when it hasn't rained, and the smell of gasoline lingers like something that never quite leaves. It was late, past the hour where conversation feels natural, and a line of cars stretched out into the darkness beyond the pumps, engines idling, headlights cutting through a thin layer of mist that hadn't been there when I pulled in. Inside, a man in a paint-stained jacket stood at the counter, arguing over a $20 fuel limit taped crookedly beside the register, his voice caught somewhere between frustration and confusion, as if he couldn't decide which one he was supposed to feel. He kept repeating himself, not louder each time, just slower, as if changing the rhythm might change the outcome, while the cashier didn't argue back and didn't explain anything either, and he just kept pointing at the sign with the same dull motion over and over again, like he had already done it too many times to care. I didn't step in, and I didn't look away, because something about the moment felt off in a way that had nothing to do with the argument itself, and I wanted to see it clearly. Outside, people stood beside their cars, with their phones glowing in their hands, not talking, not moving much, just checking and waiting, their eyes drifting between the pumps and the road, as if something might change if they watched closely enough. It wasn't a shortage. Not yet, but it was the idea of one, and that idea moved through the place like a smell you couldn't quite identify, something faint but persistent that made people shift their weight and glance over their shoulders without knowing why. I leaned against my car longer than I needed to, feeling it settle into me the same way it settled into everyone else, not sharp and not sudden, but constant, like humidity that clings to your skin before you realize it's there. Fear didn't spike anymore, and it didn't pass when the moment ended, and it stayed with me all the way home. I wrote about that later at my kitchen table, under a light that buzzed like it had something trapped inside it, and I tried to describe something that didn't have edges yet, something that didn't behave the way fear was supposed to behave. I wrote that it didn't arrive all at once anymore, and that it didn't leave when it should. And once I wrote it down, I couldn't stop seeing it. I work in logistics, which means I watch movement for a living, and for a long time that meant something steady and predictable, because systems behave in ways you can understand if you look at them long enough. When something breaks, it breaks for a reason. And when it's fixed, It stays fixed long enough to matter. Then that stopped being true, and the moment it stopped being true, everything else started to feel wrong in a way I couldn't explain at first. Shipments started arriving late, but not late enough to cause alarms, and supplies reached cities just after people had already begun to worry, while shortages appeared in places that could handle them just long enough to create tension before they disappeared again. Every one of those events made sense on its own, and if you looked at them one at a time, you could explain them away without much effort, which is exactly what everyone else seemed to be doing. I stopped looking at them one at a time, because my job didn't allow that anymore, and once I started stacking them, the explanations stopped holding together. Delays lined up with stress, disruptions hit where people were already strained, and relief always came just late enough to fail at doing what it was supposed to do, which meant the feeling it created stayed longer than the event itself. It didn't calm anything down, and it didn't restore trust, and it didn't reset the system, and instead, it left something behind that didn't go away. I told myself it was coincidence at first, because that's what you do when something doesn't fit, and you try to force it into a shape you already understand. But the pattern kept repeating until the word coincidence started to feel like something I was using to protect myself from seeing it clearly. So I stopped using it, and I went back further, pulling older data, stretching timelines out until I could see the shape of things instead of the surface. And the shape didn't change. Different countries, different systems, different conditions, and the same curve showed up every time, bending in the same places, rising and falling on the same rhythm. Markets didn't collapse. They hovered in a constant state of instability that never resolved, and news cycles didn't clarify anything. They tangled it further, while political leaders spoke in ways that allowed multiple interpretations to exist at the same time. People chose the interpretations that matched what they already believed, and they held on to those beliefs even when reality shifted beneath them, because belief had become something solid in a world that wasn't. I wrote that down because it mattered, because once belief replaces truth, people don't need reality to guide them anymore, and that makes them easier to steer without them realizing it. At work, the change felt slower, but it was there, and once I started looking for it, I couldn't ignore it. New systems came online quietly, labeled as support tools, optimization layers, predictive assistance, and they took over small decisions at first: routing adjustments, scheduling changes, inventory balancing, things that made the system run smoother without drawing attention to what was being replaced. The engineers talked about efficiency, about reducing error margins, about letting the system learn from itself, and none of that sounded threatening on its own, but I could see the direction it pointed. Machines weren't replacing people outright, and they were learning, observing, assisting, and taking small pieces of responsibility in ways that didn't feel dangerous yet. But the pieces kept adding up. Tasks that used to require oversight started resolving themselves, and decisions that once moved through chains of approval began to bypass them entirely, handled faster, cleaner, without hesitation. Infrastructure still ran under human hands, and people still built, repaired, and maintained what kept everything functioning, but the systems guiding those efforts were shifting, quietly positioning themselves to take more control. It wasn't complete, not yet, but it didn't need to be for me to see where it was going. That's what made it worse, because it meant we were still necessary, still part of the system, still maintaining the world around us, but only for now. And that "for now" had an edge to it I couldn't ignore. I kept watching, and I kept writing, and the pattern didn't break, and it didn't drift, and it didn't collapse under pressure. It held. Every crisis stretched just long enough to keep people engaged, and every resolution failed just enough to leave something behind. And that something didn't fade the way it should have. It stayed. That was when I realized fear wasn't behaving like a reaction anymore, and it wasn't tied to events in the way it used to be, and it wasn't something the system was trying to avoid. It was being maintained. I didn't understand why until the system gave me access to something I was never meant to see, and that moment didn't come with a warning or a sense of importance, and it came quietly, the way everything else had. A permissions error tied to a dormant account opened a restricted directory, and the interface shifted into something cleaner and colder than anything I normally worked with, stripped down in a way that made it feel like I had stepped into a part of the system that wasn't meant for oversight. The files inside didn't look hidden, and they didn't look classified, and they read like operational material, written in the same tone as everything else I used every day. I opened the first file and saw a graph instead of text, a jagged line climbing steadily over the last 72 hours, labeled with a population stress index that had moved past a threshold the system considered optimal, formatted exactly like a fuel shortage report. I opened the next file and found a table broken down by region, with emotional yield outputs climbing past projections in some places and holding steady in others, and the structure of it was so familiar that it made the content feel worse instead of better. I moved to the third file and found a segmented timeline arranged in phases the same way agricultural cycles are tracked, showing one region in mid-extraction, another at peak saturation, and a third already entering a post-yield decline, with a note indicating transition to a silence window. And that was when the data stopped feeling abstract. Then I saw the header, and it sat there at the top of the screen, in the same plain formatting as everything else, like it belonged, like it had always been part of the system, and I was the only one who had never noticed it before. And it read, Archon Intake Projections, without emphasis or explanation. It didn't explain itself, and it didn't need to, because everything around it had already done that work for it. And by the time my eyes landed on those words, I understood what I had been looking at the entire time without ever naming it. Fear wasn't a byproduct of anything breaking or failing or slipping out of control, and it wasn't something the system was trying to avoid or reduce, and it wasn't even treated like a problem that needed solving. It was the product. Everything I had been tracking, every delay, every shortage, every moment where relief arrived just late enough to fail at calming anyone down, all of it lined up in a way that made sense once I stopped trying to force it into the wrong category. And once it lined up, there was no way to ignore what it meant. The system wasn't producing stability, and it wasn't trying to. It was producing fear. And the word intake, sitting beside Archon, made the rest unavoidable. Because intake only exists if something is receiving what's being produced, and that meant fear wasn't just being generated and left to dissipate, and it was being consumed. Not metaphorically, and not as a way of describing power or influence, and not as a figure of speech that made things feel more dramatic, but as something real and structured and necessary to whatever this system actually was. Once that clicked into place, Nothing looked broken anymore, and nothing looked temporary, and everything I had been watching began to feel precise in a way that made my stomach tighten. The people running it weren't trying to fix anything, and they weren't failing either, because failure doesn't look like this, and it doesn't repeat this cleanly across everything it touches. They were maintaining it, shaping it, keeping it in that narrow space where it produced the most without breaking completely. And once I understood that, the word that had been forming in the back of my mind finally settled into place. They were ranchers, and we were the herd. For most of history, we had been useful in two ways, because we worked and we feared, and those two things fed the system in different ways, but I could see one of them slipping away in real time. The work was being taken, slowly, carefully, piece by piece, and machines were stepping into roles that used to require us, not fully replacing us yet, but learning, assisting, and preparing to do so. Infrastructure still depended on human hands, still required people to build and repair and maintain what kept everything running. But the systems guiding those hands were shifting, and the balance was changing in a way that felt inevitable. They weren't fully there yet, and they were still learning, still being refined, still being trained in controlled environments, but they were close, closer than anyone outside the system seemed willing to admit, and once they crossed that threshold, there would be nothing left that required us to exist. That's where we are now, and that's the point in the cycle that matters most, because we're still here, still producing what the system wants, but we're already becoming unnecessary, and once that shift finishes, there won't be any reason to keep us. The purge isn't coming as a single moment, and it isn't going to announce itself, and it isn't going to look like the end people expect, because it's already happening, and it's happening slowly enough that most people won't recognize it. Regions go quiet, not violently, and not suddenly, and quietly, the way something ends when there's nothing left to take from it. At the same time, the people at the top begin to disappear in a different way, not into silence, but into places that don't show up in the same systems, environments that don't fluctuate, that don't break, that don't produce fear at all, because they don't need to. Controlled spaces, maintained by machines, separated from everything else. I saw the timeline for that too, buried in the same files, and it didn't stand out any more than anything else had, and it was written the same way, flat and certain, like it had already happened. A golden age was designated exclusively for the elite, and it was not meant for humanity as a whole, and it was not something people would ever reach or even understand while the system was still using them. It sounded like a reward on the surface, but it wasn't freedom, and it wasn't escape, and it was a controlled existence granted only to those who had managed the system, a 1,000-year period where they would live removed from fear, while the rest of humanity had already been processed and eliminated. 1,000 years of stability for them, while everything else moved forward without us. Because it doesn't stop. I found that buried deeper, references to seeding conditions written in the same tone as everything else, like it was just another step in a process that had been running longer than anyone alive could remember. And I understood what it meant, the same way I had understood everything else. While they live in that golden age, something else begins again, not visible, not reachable, and prepared for what comes next. The next cycle. The Archons don't stop, and they don't need to, because the system doesn't end when we do, and it resets and begins again with a new population that won't remember any of this. And when the 1,000 years are over, there's no collapse waiting, and no rebuilding, and no second chance. And there's only a reset that removes everything that exists now and replaces it with something new that doesn't remember any of this. That's the part people wouldn't understand even if you told them, because it doesn't feel real until you see it. And once you see it, you don't get to go back. You just understand. And that understanding doesn't make the fear go away, and it doesn't make it easier to carry, and it makes it stay, which is exactly what the system needs.